I'm Carys and
And I'm James Meadway, and you're listening to Over the Top, Under the Radar.
A weekly look at the stories in the news being overreported and the ones that are going completely under the radar and not being talked about enough. My co-host this week is economist and host of the brilliant Macrodose podcast, James Meadway. James is a former Treasury civil servant, former Labour advisor, current Green Party candidate, and general smart person about economics. James, thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a delight to be here on another busy morning for the world.
Yeah, I mean, I assume you're thinking about what I'm thinking about, which is the Brooklyn Beckham Instagram stories.
Oh, absolutely.
Imagine you're glued to them.
Yeah, I can't get enough of it. I mean, it is the feud we were looking for after the royal family seemed to have calmed things down a bit.
It is that weird kind of, it does have a Prince Harry energy to it, of the sort of, I'm so hard done by. And also, like, why are people, I hadn't feel like his parents briefing against him in the media. Like, what's going on here?
Oh, okay. I mean, maybe I have a very innocent.
Well, that's it.
I have a very innocent reading of it,
thing said.
which is that they were being super nice to him in public anyway. Oh, the door's always open, all that sort of thing, you know.
Yeah, but his Instagram story suggests, there's been like a whisper campaign. So, I mean, this isn't one of our topics for the week, but I am slightly intrigued by the fact he's like married into this billionaire, like kind of Trumpian family. So he's like able to speak out because he's got the deep pockets of his in-laws.
I thought I recognised the name. I didn't really. This is how little attention I managed to pay. Yeah. So right, it is that Peltz. In fact,
it is that Peltz. To be honest, I wasn't sure if you'd know. Also, I'm impressed that I was like, James is far too serious to know about Brooklyn Beckham.
I keep my finger on the pulse. It's not. I'm not going to miss a story like this one.
So yeah, I mean, that's obviously been attracting a lot of attention. And for those of you who haven't been looking at, who don't know what we're talking about, Brooklyn Beckham, eldest child of David and Victoria Beckham, posted a series of kind of Instagram stories, like a sort of Instagram press release about his very fraught relationship with his family. And it was a real kind of royal family Prince Harry energy. It was like a weird list of gripes about things at the wedding, like Victoria had hijacked the first dance and danced with him, and what table relatives were sat at, and like he has all these, his family. But the bit that I think is a bit damaging to them is this idea that the Beckham family is just all about the brand and all about money and all about reputation, and it's not a real family, and they aren't nice to each other, and they're all just about making brand Beckham look strong, which I think is that kind of tracks, doesn't it?
Tracks, but it's also exactly like the royal family at that point. The firm,
yeah,
it's like the parallels are uncanny by now. Yeah, it's quite uncanny. Something. It's this sort of micro drama can spend a great deal of time on that. It sort of doesn't add up to a row of beans when you get down to it. Like two rich people are having a bit of a spat. Like, okay.
Yes, and a lot of the spat seem to involve like following and unfollowing on Instagram, which just kind of feels a little bit teenage. Like Brooklyn blocked his mother after she liked a picture of his chicken. Which, like, I mean, we do need a diversion in these very dark times, and in that sense, there's it's kind of welcome distraction from the actual problems in the world. But I do feel like like Prince Harry, there is a bit of like poor little rich kid. I mean, Brooklyn Beckham's kind of like the like definitive nepo baby. Yeah. He's had all these like careers.
He was a photographer, wasn't he?
He's a photographer. He was not a good photographer. He was a chef. I think maybe still is a chef. I think he makes his own hot sauce. Like there's a bit of gratitude lacking from like what his parents have provided him. Obviously, I don't know what it's like to be part of brand Beckham, but yeah, it was a little bit like, I mean, mate, you've basically got to try your hand at any job you wanted to do, regardless of whether you were qualified because of your parents. So like,
and now you've married into a possibly even richer family. Chuck that one in as well. And I mean, I had a certain degree of sympathy for Prince Harry when a lot of this stuff was drumming on. There's a bit where you think, it's not like incredibly privileged existence really when you get down to it, but there's a certain amount of like, this doesn't sound great, some of this stuff. And of course, Harry's going to be back in the news this week, actually, isn't he? This is me keeping my finger on the pulse.
Yes, he's in. We haven't got this week, but I think he's suing the Daily Mail. He's kind of permanently suing a tabloid. No, I think, the difference with the Prince Harry thing, and I do think it's interesting with Brooklyn Beckham, right? He's got the protection of the Peltz billionaire dynasty. I think he's got lawyers. But yeah, I mean, Prince Harry, I did read Spare, which I'm just going to confess to now. And when you actually hear about his childhood, it is kind of sad and grim. He loses his mum really young. He's constantly in the media. Everyone is like briefing stories about how stupid he is. And yeah, you're just like, if you could pick, you'd just be rich, wouldn't you? You wouldn't be like a member of the royal family. You'd just be like Nicola Peltz, who is, has a billionaire father who just helps to bankroll her acting career. Well, those of you tuning in for the politics, don't worry. James and I have taken a look at the news agenda beyond the Beckhams, and we've each picked a story that we think has gone over the top in its coverage this week, or one that we think has flown under the radar and not been talked about enough. And I'm going to kick us off. My over the top for this week is Trump and Greenland. I think you'd have to be hiding under a rock to have missed some part of this story. Donald Trump, President of the United States, is potentially going to invade Greenland, going to buy Greenland. It's not completely clear. He wants Greenland. He's got his sights set on Greenland. And the latest kind of twist and turn in this saga is that he is threatening his favorite thing, tariffs on European nations if they block his acquisition of Greenland. So I think it is, we are rightly hearing a lot about this story, hot on the heels of Venezuela. I think the thing that I don't love about the coverage, and I'd be interested in your reflections on it, James, is that as ever, a geopolitical story kind of becomes about Trump's psychodrama. And there's so much stuff about, so much stuff about, oh, well, who's briefing him and who's in his ear. And, well, I'll just name them. The Guardian ran a big story about the billionaire that's persuaded Trump to invade Greenland. And there's a couple of things I want to say about that. So, number one, there are geopolitical and economic reasons that America, not just Donald Trump, would want to occupy Greenland. It has military significance in terms of where it is located vis-a-vis Russia. In fact, there are military bases in Greenland already, just like there are US military bases in most countries in the world. There are a number in the UK. So it's geopolitically significant. It has these rare earth minerals, which at the moment China has basically a monopoly on. Thanks to global warming and the melting of the ice caps in Greenland, there we will be able to access some of those minerals. And there are a number of companies, drilling companies, mineral companies that have big economic investments in Greenland. So it's not silly or weird or random. It's a geopolitically significant region. So that's the main thing I would make. Second point I would make is it is also occupied by Denmark. The people who are indigenous to Greenland are not Danish. Let's not pretend that Denmark's right to Greenland is anything other than European powers carving up the world. And then I guess the final thing I would to say before kind of kicking over to you, James, I'd be interested in your thoughts on is, as ever with Trump, we get this presentation of this move as some new paradigm. World politics has been upended. This is so erratic. There are implications for NATO of Trump kind of disregarding NATO and saying to another NATO power, a founding NATO power, I want some of your turf. But this idea that billionaires and companies are driving foreign policy in a way that we haven't seen before, a little bit ahistorical. I'm just going to throw out Halliburton, Lockheed Martin, Iraq, behind most big American and French and British imperialist foreign policy sits a bunch of people who are going to make money from it. So I think there's a bit of a pretending this is special and different when it isn't. But I'm interested in what you think, James. Am I going over the top on that?
No, don't think so at all. I think it's one bit I agree with, one bit I slightly disagree with from what you said, but let's sort of come back to that. The first bit is, oh God, it's so boring by this point to convert what is happening into the world into the whims of Donald Trump. Aside from it being flattering to Donald Trump personally, I think he no doubt loves the idea that everybody is, he wakes up, does a quick tweet or whatever you call it on Truth Social that he uses now, and suddenly everyone's hopping around and talking obsessively about Donald Trump, and here we are talking about Donald Trump. But the kind of the psychodrama, they're like, oh, it's because he's a senile old man who doesn't know what he's doing, and it's look, all of this may be sort of personally true on several levels, right? Donald Trump is increasingly elderly. He does have a fairly set view of how the world ought to be, and he is kind of applying it. That's kind of part of it. The bigger story is, how have we got to the point where America, the USA, actually has this as how the thing is being governed and run? How have we got to the point where the world system is so sort of unstable that this is in fact what starts to knock it and make it act in a different way? And what else can we say about, exactly as you said, about the sort of the very wealthy individuals and corporations clustered around Trump. I mean, what are they going to be getting out of all this? In the case of Greenland, it was treated as a bit of a joke when Trump raised this in public back in 2019. He was actually discussing privately how to acquire Greenland as early as 2017. Right, there's a Reuters report on this. He was already trying to get his little paws onto Greenland really quite some time ago, like barely a year into his first term. If you've been following a bit of the news, and it's not been particularly well reported here, which is why, although I don't think it's much excuse for it, it should not have been a bolt from the blue that Trump had some designs in Greenland. The news over the last 12 months has been consistently America doing what in other situations, if this was Russia doing it to one of its neighbors, would call it an influence operation. Interestingly, a Danish state broadcaster had a report over the summer on a secret services report from Danish security services. We assume it was a bit vague, saying that there were 5 or 6 American men operating in Greenland who were conducting an influence operation, drawing up lists, for instance, of local supporters for Donald Trump, pro-secession supporters of Donald Trump, and also more sinisterly drawing up lists of people who opposed secession, or at least opposed Donald Trump, right? Which Denmark rather complained about, called the US ambassador in, and also staged the largest military exercises in Greenland's modern history over the summer, involving other NATO members, not including the US. So this thing has been rumbling on for a while. This has not arrived out of nowhere. It's been a pretty insistent pressure point that Donald Trump has been applying since. The bit I think that we tend to miss here, probably because it's just too huge a thing to think about in terms of like what happens in day-to-day politics and how people behave and what countries do and all this sort of stuff, I think on the normal level that we can just about grasp, is climate change. I mean, Donald Trump has a kind of instinctive grasp of climate change. Right? He's a climate change denier, but he has a really sort of deep understanding that this is a thing that's going to reshape how the world operates on a sort of really innate, kind of horrible zero-sum game kind of level. He just understands that this is going to shake things up and you have to grab what you can out of it. In the case of Greenland, all of those critical minerals, all the oil and gas banned by the Greenlandic government from exploration and drilling at the minute, but it all gets cheaper and easier to get to if the ice isn't there. It's quicker and easier to get military equipment and vehicles. And by the way, the militarization of the Arctic has been rumbling on for several years now, as everybody has realized that melting Arctic ice makes it really important to try and get up there. It's strategic positioning. The fact that the Northern Sea route along the coast of Russia has been used for the first time. Back in October, a Chinese container ship came from eastern China and docked in Felixstowe on the 10th of October or so. And it's the first time that any commercial run has done this. That's a new sea route that's opened up. It's about 20 days quicker than going all the way around through the Suez Canal when the Suez Canal is open and it's not blocked by the Houthis, who, of course, earlier in the year, Donald Trump had to rather embarrassingly kind of sign a kind of deal with and back off from American attacks and patrols in the region. Anyway, that's what's going on in the Arctic. That's why Donald Trump is thinking about this. And everyone going, oh, it's just some weird sort of fetish he has. I'm sorry, you're missing a major part of the story here. Is it, and this is my slight disagreement, is it just the same old, same old? And it's like, well, yeah, like there's a great pretend. I mean, we're both old enough to remember Iraq, right? And do you know, it's a very strange thing going on with that, where you had the US at the time busily desperately trying to tell everyone that this wasn't about oil. No, it's about democracy and regime change and WNDs and inventing WNDs that weren't there notoriously, and desperately trying to get a UN resolution through to prove it was all about democracy, really, and they had the legal authority to do it and that sort of thing. And all of us on the left were saying, nah, it's all about oil. Look at Halliburton. Look at everyone making money out of it. There's been a bit of a weird inversion with this, where Donald Trump literally says, well, in the case of Venezuela, this is all about the oil. And like there's a whole bunch of lefties going, no, there's actually some deep, clever, sophisticated thing. And it's not really, right? That, I think, is a shift, by the way, that if you're getting to the point where the US is just quite nakedly doing resource exploitation, it's a shift. If you get to the point where the US is backing out of, or trying to back out of, not very successfully, but he's trying to get there, back out of the Middle East. The Abraham Accords, signed under Donald Trump's first term, was the US trying to get out of the Middle East and handing it over for, it's relatively more or less loyal little helpers over there to sort of look after the place. That's what they're trying to do. Backing out of the Middle East, talking about the Monroe Doctrine, converted in a fairly crap pun to the Donroe Doctrine by President Trump
Can't
himself.
handle that.
But this is kind of new. I mean, it's a reversion to, kind of an earlier version of what you'd have to call US imperialism, like a real sort of pre-First World War version of US imperialism. But it's new relative to what's been happening in the last few decades. It's a retreat from America, understanding itself as a sort of global policeman, enforcing the rules. Sure, it lands in America's favor, but the kind of rules everyone can stick to. Now it's like, forget the rules. We're literally just looking after America, and our zone of interest is the Western Hemisphere, and that's it.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, yeah, agree with so much of that. And I think really important to name that Greenland, it's not just the United States that's interested in Greenland. It's like a very geopolitically significant region for lots of economic reasons. Like, so sidebar to that, there's a Australian company called Energy Transition Minerals who have said that they think Greenland has the potential to become the most significant Western world producer of critical rare earths. So like this is, yeah, it's not just America, it's not just Russia, it's China, it's everyone. And another sidebar to that, just to say, the US the other thing that I find weird is people sort of make a joke about Trump trying to buy Greenland, but America did try to
Yes.
buy Greenland
Yes.
in 1946. So like, again, none of this is without precedent. I guess the bit I want to dig in on is I think like the left response, you're right, is different to Bush in Iraq. And you're also right to highlight that an international strategy that is really focused on America's immediate physical backyard and more focused on withdrawing from the Middle East, it is different. But I think the thing that feels the same is in both instances, this is an American foreign policy really rooted in this ideology of realism. So, like, there is no international government really. It's just about who has the most guns, who has the most money, and who has the most power. And, like, as much as Bush paid lip service to the UN and this, like, notion of WMDs, like, it was just a sort of veneer of respectability and PR. Like, there was no world in which Iraq wasn't going to be invaded, just like there was no world in which Afghanistan wasn't going to be invaded. It's like, I think isn't the difference just presentational at this point? Like, is there a meaningful difference between like the neocons in like the early 2000s and I'm not going to say the Donroe Doctrine, like what Trump and his kind of cohort of people now, like even, I mean, John Bolton is even a constant, like, isn't it the same people, just slightly different companies? Like how different is it?
I think part of understanding what Trump is doing, or maybe not Trump, but certainly the people around him, and there's entering the second Trump presidency, there's been a lot more effort put into providing a kind of doctrine for it. Project 2025, as people know about, this sort of reconstruction of the American state, the destruction of the administrative state, I think was Steve Bannon's phrase for that. There's the Clarendon Institute, sort of long-standing, quite hard right American foreign policy focused institute with lots and lots of people scattered throughout the Trump administration now. So there's a much more sort of strategic and intellectual effort here. And one way to understand it, I think, is in response to the failures of not just George Bush, but also of Obama, as they would see it. Actually, it's fair enough to see it like this because it is a bit of a failure that Iraq and Afghanistan did not work out well. The project for the new American century has gone completely off the rails. I mean, this was the old pressure group / think tank back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, which was quite blunt about, this is the unipolar moment, as they would call it, for the US coming out of the Cold War. We can reshape the world entirely in our interests. We can be the dominant power, the hegemon that supplies all these sort of public goods to the rest of the world. We will enforce the laws. Everybody will be better off. Pax Americana for all. That's kind of how they'd see it. And that would require the knocking out of adversaries to this sort of globalizing regime, of which they'd view Iraq as rather pointedly as one, but also in a not so subtle manner. You'd also like try and think about potentially governments closer to you that would be acting domestically against US corporate interests, that would say, well, we want to nationalize, this energy producer, we want to do various things, raise taxes on US corporations, all of this sort of stuff. So it was there as a vision of how America could run the globe, ultimately to the benefit of America, but it was also, this will also do well for you as well. Like you will get something out of this. What we're getting now is, I think, is a real retreat from that. Like, there's no real pretense of saying we're going to run the globe. It's like, we're going to run this bit and it's going to be good for us, America first. It's not like, hey, everyone's tagging along. It's like, that was a complete shit show, as it turned out. The last 20 years have not been good for the US. China's on the rise, right? We're going to have to. And this would be my reading of it. If you pick out the National Security Strategy published in December, just ahead of the Venezuela operation, where it basically says, we're going to be really concerned about the Americas and not so concerned about the rest of the world. That's just going to be, we're going to deal with it, but it's not going to be our primary focus for everything. So it feels like a shift, and it feels like a response as much as anything else from that part of the Washington foreign policy establishment to the failure of Bush and Obama, as much as it is responding to the rise of China, for example.
Which I think is fair, and I think it does then connect to the other part of the press coverage of this story that I don't know if it's overblown, but this idea of the demise of NATO. Again, I would say like this isn't the only symptom of that. That's kind of like a long run trend that we've seen over decades. But I think the interesting thing, and to your point, this insistence from JD Vance and Trump and others in the administration that like Europe needs to up its defense spending. We're sick of like paying for Europe's wars. We don't care about Ukraine. Like, do you think it is the beginning of the end of NATO? Does that matter? Do we need to increase our defense spending?
Well, look, it feels like the beginning of the end for NATO in its current form. I mean, that seems to be pretty like backing down from this one, where you basically have various NATO members with some distance from this, but kind of threatening some form of military operation against each other. I mean, so much for the article, whichever it was, of collective self-defense. I mean, what you're supposed to do is like it's hard to make a military alliance work in the way it would have done coming out of the back of that. And JD Vance, who you mentioned, Vice President JD Vance, signalled this long enough ago. It was March last year, where he pops up at the Munich Security Conference, one of these big international gatherings, in this case with a sort of security focus for the developed world in particular. Basically tells all the European defense ministers and heads of state, everybody else who's there, that you're on your own and we don't care. And the people we really like Viktor Orban and various sort of pretty unpleasant nationalist figures scattered throughout Europe. And that's what we want. And otherwise you're by yourself. So much for not just the sort of George Bush post-Cold War New World Order, as George H.W. Bush called it. This is America as a sole superpower. Not just goodbye to that, it's goodbye to the entire post-World War II liberal order at this point. It's like, what's going to happen to the United Nations? The talk that Donald Trump's ludicrous Board of Peace, so-called, for Gaza, is that he sees it as an alternative to the UN Security Council, able to manage the affairs of the world without all the nonsense and paraphernalia, as he would see it, of the United Nations. NATO was set up shortly after the UN was. It's one of these post-World War II liberal world order institutions.
Bretton Woods era, all of the things in the 40s and 50s. If you don't have liberal politics and you're left-wing, you don't really want to end up defending institutions that aren't particularly just or like helpful, or haven't delivered a kind of, post-World War II, there has been a relative period of peace in Europe, but you get into this weird position where you're like, am I trying to defend NATO and the UN Security Council? Like, these aren't things that I particularly believe in. So like, where do you think we end up as left-wing people in the face of this?
Well, first is I think to understand the sort of the severity and the unusual nature of this moment. This is like completely unprecedented on a whole stack of reasons why we're living now is kind of unprecedented in my lifetime, and potentially a bigger shock than, for example, the fall of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall coming down. Right, this is the biggest scale of what might happen to transform some of the basic institutions the world has been governed by for a long period of time, which is kind of terrifying because the person doing most of that upsetting and the administration doing most of that has a particularly clear view about what it wants to do and also how it thinks the rest of the world ought to respond to that. And it's not one that I would share or you would share or most people listening to this would share by a long way. But the fact they've upset everything, the fact that anything can happen does in fact mean anything can happen. That if you just kicked over a whole load of ways that the world was running that was actually, as you say, it was wrong and unjust and bad in myriad different ways, then there is the potential there to think about what might be better and different. And some of that you can see emerging. Like the fact that the US is pulling out of various climate change agreements does not mean that action on climate just stops internationally, right? It doesn't. The US is itself, and this is one way to understand Donald Trump and everybody around him. The US is itself not as powerful relatively as it once was. It's a smaller part of the world economy. It's challenged by, as they call it in Washington, a peer competitor in the form of China. It's not the single superpower it once was. And that creates a space of opportunity potentially for the rest of us and the rest of the world.
Thank you to Caroline, who signed up to support the podcast this week on Patreon. We make the podcast thanks to our brilliant community of Patreon supporters who donate each month to keep the show running. a few hundred people who give from £3 each month to cover our production costs. We need 90 more supporters to make the show sustainable. So if you've been thinking about signing up, please do it today. If you sign up to support us on Patreon, you get a bonus episode each week, the chance to submit questions to our guests, and access to our over-under WhatsApp community to continue the conversation between shows. You can join Patreon for as little as £3 a month. Go to patreon.com/overthetop under the radar. What's gone over the top for you this week?
Over the top for me is another institution on the verge of disappearance, and it's the Conservative Party. Ruled this country for most of the last 200 years now, apparently facing an existential crisis that started relatively slowly with Nadeem Zahawi's defection, the former Chancellor, who was briefly Chancellor, wasn't Chancellor very long, but he was pretty senior Tory, to reform, and then gathered pace with Robert Jenrick's rather messy exit a few days ago, and of course a couple more defections since. Now, word this morning is that Kemi Badenoch is preparing for another 5 defections, senior Tories, or at least MPs, over to reform. And this feels like it's moved from being like, yeah, there's a couple of like not necessarily that serious people who've gone to reform. I mean, it's a bit of a mixed bag, and now it's getting to like, hang on a minute, this is like significant former cabinet ministers, current shadow cabinet ministers, people with a bit of reputation, who are suddenly jumping ship, and reform are still way ahead in the Tories in the polls, come down a bit. But, they are the leading party in the polls by some distance at this point in time. And for all the talk of Kemi Badenoch bounce, it's not really done that much to claw back anything. So is this existential, I suppose?
We talked about not quite Jenrick because he resigned in dramatic fashion at the end of the week, but we talked about Nadeem Zahawi last week, and I think defections aren't covered well by the bubble because people fixate on like the disloyalty and the kind of, again, interpersonal psychodrama when every single election we ask people to defect. People switch parties all the time, and so I think that how it's read to ordinary voters isn't how it's read inside the Westminster bubble. Having said that, I think there's something interesting about the combination of these defections and the coming May elections, where we're going to have the Welsh Senedd all re-elected, Scottish Parliament, lots of local elections in England, although they are postponing some of them, but like all of London. And what Farage is starting to say is that like this set of elections will be when we put the final nail in the coffin of the Tory parties and position ourselves as the opposition party against Labour. And I think the thing that I sort of hasn't changed my mind on it, but I've been sort of digging into being like, is like, as you said, Conservative Party, one of the most politically successful parties probably in Western Europe, the Western world. Like it's been in government most of the time for the last 100 odd years. The thing that's slightly changed my mind on this is looking at the money and just how much money reform is raising. This is all available on the Electoral Commission's website. We can put it in the show notes. Compared to the Tories, like it's outraising every single political party. And I guess in my head, part of the secret sauce that makes the Tory party so powerful, its relationship with the British elite and establishment, the newspapers, but also the moneyed classes. And that sense that there could be a fracturing, like the Tories have had power because they're pragmatic, because they're posh, and because they've got loads of cash. And I guess, are they starting to lose some of those pillars? So yeah, do you think this is this the death knell? Are the Tories going to die? Should we mourn them?
Well, it's a bit. I mean, in practice, you feel like there'll be a big fight to keep the Tories alive, not least from the Conservative leadership and people still associated with it. I mean, Nick Timothy, who replaced Jenrick as Shadow Justice Secretary, popping up on radio to say, "Well, I'll be a Tory till I die," and I think there'll be a fair chunk of them behave like that. Farage, interestingly, I think also sees the future as one in which there is some kind of pact or cooperation with the Conservative Party. Like the Financial Times had a report, essentially a sort of leaked recording, I think it was, of Farage talking to a bunch of exactly these big donors that they're now starting to attract over in reform. And his pitch was more or less, hey, we're going to do well, but we know we're going to have to deal with the Tories. Now, I'm kind of paraphrasing somewhat there, but it seems fairly clear that, and it makes sense if you look at the polling, right? And you look at how the electoral system works. It's like you probably bet that Reform aren't going to win a majority. If they do get a majority, it's a slender majority. You need to do a deal with the Tories in some form. I mean, that was, I thought, Robert Jenrick's main pitch. There seems to be some suggestion. Bizarre how these things happen, that a speech announcing his defection was left lying around and somehow made it into...
But also it is interesting because to get into the weeds of it, lobby journalists pressed them, is it a WhatsApp exchange? And people were like, no, it was like a non-digital piece of evidence. So this is where we have this notion of like a photocopier or a printer with a my resignation speech written on it, which I mean, it seems beyond belief, but I guess at this point, nothing's out of bounds in British
Well,
politics.
I mean, it's easy enough to leave something on a printer, but you'd think that perhaps your super secret resignation speech and why I defected to the reform would not be the,
So MPs do have printers in
well,
their offices. I'm still just trying to
so many
work out like
questions, and it just
how.
doesn't entirely stack up as what happened. I mean,
No.
sheer incompetence can always be a factor, but this feels a little bit more. Without getting too far into any shenanigans that might have occurred around this, the bigger picture is like reform probably only cut a deal with the Tories at some point. The challenge for the Conservative Party is that they will end up, it looks like, the junior partner in that arrangement, and that is something that will be profoundly, even without ceasing to exist as an institution, that's an existential crisis for the Conservative Party. I mean, it is like 200 years or so. This country has been ruled at least 75% of the time by the Conservative Party. And the only time they've been in a coalition government, it was very clearly as the senior, the larger partner. I mean, this is what the national government in the 1930s and then wartime coalition governments. And those are the only two that spring to mind. It just hasn't happened.
Well, and obviously the Nick Clegg, David Cameron.
Yeah, but as
2010.
the senior partner, of course, how could I forget?
Yeah, senior partner.
How could I forget? I mean, that seemed a bit worrying at the time, but they bounced out of it. They almost over succeeded.
Well, it worked so well for them, didn't they? Bouncing to majority. Yeah. I mean, I think the bit that I am interested in that again, I think gets lost in the like Punch and Judy, who's up, who's down. I mean, as we're recording this, we're still waiting on this Labour defection that's been promised. It's been delayed. Who knows who it is? Kate Hoey, someone else, Kate Hoey, someone Brexit. But I think it's worth I guess the other thing I think we sort of have to put into context is that like the Tory party has been under siege from the Brexit Party, UKIP reform, like part of the reason why this feels, I don't think it's terminal. I just feel like if there's anything that you can believe in, it's like the ability of the Tory party to bounce back. It's just such a ruthless machine designed for survival. It believes in nothing other than it should be in power. And it's been pretty good at securing that. They get rid of leaders. The number of leaders they've knifed in the back. So like, you're not going to win. Michael Howard, Ian Duncan Smith, many. So, I mean, I don't think we should count the Tory party out because they have been, because the story of the last 100 odd years is that they will come back, they will regenerate like Doctor Who. But I do think there is this broader trend of this is about a split within, the British elite and the right around Europe, Euroscepticism. I guess there are some sort of dotted lines to what we were talking about with Trump. And we got the referendum on Brexit because of the threat that UKIP posed to David Cameron's Conservative Party. So, I think the other thing that, we're not always getting when we're getting these defections is the Tory party has been somewhat under siege by Nigel Farage's various political projects for some time. So in a sense, maybe it's like a war of attrition. And finally, they found in this sort of populist right, we can try and be a bit economically schizophrenic so that we can attract sort of working class lefty voters. And it just almost feels like they've been under siege for a long time. And this has just been the most effective attack on them.
That said, I think the kind of the sort of, from a British point of view, unconventional right-wing populism that Farage was happily doing for the last 12 months or so has now ended. That weird point where Nigel Farage could troop off up to Scunthorpe and say he's going to nationalise British Steel, this long-standing admirer of Margaret Thatcher, and then head off down to Port Talbot and wave a Union placard around on outside the gates of Steelwork, and man of the people, and he's going to nationalise British Steel, and he's going to end the two-child benefit cap and this sort of thing. And there's a bit where he could sort of roam across the entire landscape of British politics saying what he wanted to, which I think has ended largely because of the rise of the Greens. I think that's kind of killed off his ability to talk to present a kind of left face, because there's a clear and obvious alternative there. And he's also made that, I think, pretty clear over the last few weeks or so, maybe the last month.
So do you think there has been a clear? Because for people who aren't paying close attention to Reform's policy agenda, have they sort of landed now firmly in an economically right-wing place? Because as you say, they've been showing a lot of leg on the, nationalise things. We don't like the water companies. Farage called, it's a low bar, but Farage called for the chief executive of South East Water to resign. The real question is why no one in Labour has called for that. But you think they are now sort of calcifying on the
I
right.
think so. I think they've taken a decision. You could see it in the run up to the budget is where it became apparent that they were going to have a
Mm.
reset of what they were saying in the economy, and this was now going to be, well, first we're going to do austerity, and then the really big tax cuts that we always talk about, right? At which point it's like, well, you're part of the uni party. There are sets of parties that are trying to run Britain, and you're basically part of the same shower of a sort of Treasury brain thinking, where it's like it's just austerity forever until the nice things turn up, and one day they'll turn up, and like every party has a kind of version of that, apart from the Greens, frankly, that is in a serious position to win seats in England, at least, has a version of that, and they all present a version of that. And Farage is doing the same. And that's where you think, okay, well, what's the appeal to the Red Wall at this point, really? They're probably banging on about immigration and soaking up lots and lots of what has always been something people forget, lots and lots of working class Northern Tory voters out there. Like, there has always been the case. What Reform is starting to do is try and take some of them plus a bit of Labour defectors plus a few others, and then suddenly it looks like you're threatening. That can break apart if you're also saying, oh, actually, we're going to have to carry on with austerity. Nothing's really going to change for a bit.
Yeah, but I think that assumes that people will be scrutinizing reforms policy. And like my fear is, even with the victories that they will no doubt see in the May elections, that they will still position themselves as this like challenger
Yeah, yeah.
outside the party, not the establishment, and manage to, no one's going to read the economic section of the manifesto other than, maybe you and other economists. And so then they can sort of skate along on that anti-establishment positioning until they're in power. So, I mean, you're totally right, but I guess I worry that no one will be paying
But
close
look,
enough
this
attention.
is why the rise of the Greens matters, because you can do that anti-establishment positioning for as long as it's never really challenged by any of the basically establishment parties. As soon as there's somebody else there also doing anti-establishment positioning and doing it with a bit more
Yeah.
authenticity, that becomes a harder task for you, which I think is part of the reason they're backing away from it. Like, their route to winning now isn't, here we are completely hegemonic, taking votes from wherever we want, former Labour voters, former Tory voters, glom
Mm.
everything together, a bit like Boris Johnson did actually in 2019, glom everything together around
Yeah.
Nigel Farage and Reform Party, transform British politics, off we go. That's kind of a harder task now. I don't think it's such an easy route for them if they've got like the Greens yapping at them quite rightly about they're not actually anti-establishment at all. It's a party of the rich for the rich, and that's what Reform is. And by the way, if you look at what Reform's doing, they suddenly started putting out loads of attack lines and attack ads and tweets and everything else about the Greens because
Against the
they've sniffed a
Greens. Oh,
problem.
yeah. I mean, to be honest, even in his last, if you watching a lot of Farage speeches like I am, at the last year's local election campaign launch in Birmingham, he'd already begun the attack lines. And I think as you say, they're honing them now. But even back then, he sort of saw that the threat that the Greens were. And I guess it kind of links to your Trump actually gets what the implications of climate change are. Like Nigel Farage, I think probably more than Keir Starmer and the Labour establishment sees the threat that the Green Party poses and has been trying to neutralise it. I mean, we're going to talk a bit more, I think, about that in the bonus episode. So if you're a Patreon supporter, you'll get to hear more of James's thoughts on that. But I'd love to hear your under the radar for the week, James. What have we not been talking about
Well,
enough?
my under the radar is something that has disappeared relative to this sort of fairly mad news emanating in this case from Washington DC, which is the really good analysis by Carbon Brief, who produce excellent sort of research work about the environment and climate change, and they've crunched numbers and they reckon that for the first time in about 52 years, both China and India energy generation, electricity generation from coal has dropped, which is okay. It's not a huge drop. It's not like they've turned off loads of coal power plants and it's the clean energy future, but it's a really good indicator of like where things are likely to be now heading. And the drivers of that are so against what we often get as a story from the Nigel Farages of this world and Donald Trump's, which is that why bother doing anything on climate change when China and India are just building all these coal power plants, and what's the point? Well, that's just not the case anymore. Now, it's a small decline. Carbon Brief put it down to massive investment in renewable energy over the last few years. It's really started to chew away at the share of fossil fuel production. So it's potentially a very significant moment. There could be some wobbles there. The other thing that's driven India down is relatively mild weather over the last year. So people don't turn their air conditioning on quite as much. And as a result, you have less demand for electricity and less coal being burnt. But it's actually a big, potentially positive story, I think, and one that we could do paying a bit more attention because it tells us something important about how the world is going.
It's a really good one. I had gone under my radar completely. And I think, there are a couple of things that I'd love to dig into a bit and talk to you more about. Because I think one is why it is that our kind of British media, definitely English language media, consistently underreports on what's going on in India and China. Like China, for example, has bet pretty big on like a post carbon future, post fossil fuel future, but we endlessly hear about, and we've also talked about, we're not in this unipolar world anymore. China is like, has been, will be one of the global superpowers, but we don't really hear much about Xi Jinping, and all we ever hear about is, Donald Trump's bowel movements and Truth Social posts. And I wonder if you've got any reflections on that, and then, and yeah, just a bit more context on that for people who aren't aware that, yeah, in China at least, I don't know as much about India, there has been a pretty significant bet on, climate change being real and us needing to adapt.
My short version of that, honestly, I just think it's kind of colonialism and its legacies. Do you know what I mean? It's just like, oh,
Yeah.
who's important in the world? Well, that's like America and Europe maybe, and then there's sort of
Other white people, especially if
stuff,
they speak English.
everything else over there somewhere. They're doing their thing, but
Yeah.
like it scarcely matters. And like we have not got a conventional media that's really caught up with like how the world is shifting in front of us. It's still, I think, in a
Mm.
lot of people's heads fundamentally that these are kind of small, far away, not particularly well off economies, rather than like in the case of China, rapidly either already is or soon will be, depending on how you count it, the biggest economy on the planet, and India actually not too far off that. Fastest growing major economy in the world last year was India. So I think there's a sort of shift in mentalities that you have to think about the world that isn't just centered on either Europe or things that were once colonized by Europe in the way that America was, sort of outpost of Europe in that sense. So that, I think, is quite a substantial part of it. There's some other bits in there. One of them is that because we are like post Brexit in the UK, we're kind of wandering around with very few friends, and what we seem to have ended up with is trying to cling tightly and desperately to whatever Washington is doing, like even more so than we have done in the last sort of 70 odd years or so since the end of the Second World War. And that's kind of produced this pathetic spectacle of Keir Starmer continually looking for ways to sort of wheedle and suck up to Trump, the endless state visits, a little note from Prince King Charles, all of this stuff, they're like bending over backwards or even trying it over the last day or so. Oh, Keir Starmer spoke to Donald Trump and he now understands that Greenland isn't really, we're sending troops, but it's not what you think. And of course, Donald Trump just pops up and says, hey, wasn't returning Diego Garcia to Mauritius a really stupid idea and words to that effect? Just blows the whole thing up. But we suck up to America, and the backwash from that is a real pressure because Washington has a pretty clear line in this. They're going to be a petro state. They're going to concentrate on fossil fuel production because that's their edge in the world. And China, exactly as you say, for actually it's decades now, but really accelerating in the last decade, has invested huge amounts in building the factories that will build the best and cheapest solar panels on the planet. Same thing for electric vehicles, the entire infrastructure they set up there, the massive exporting of this. I mean, this is what's really incredible to see is the surge in exports of solar panels to sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where you have places which have had at best sort of intermittent access to electricity, suddenly leaping into getting to cheap, reliable solar PVs with batteries supplied by China, and it's this jumping over that whole fossil fuel stage that other countries have had to go through. Right, it's quite an incredible shift that's taking place. America has set itself hard against that with the concentration of fossil fuels. We in Britain find ourselves, I think, pulled in the US direction. I mean, you can see all the approbation of Ed Miliband and what the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero are doing. Like, it's one of the few things in the Starmer government that's been a success on its own terms over the last sort of 18 months or so. They've actually delivered some things. It's continual in the news. Why are we doing this net zero toll cost? Blah 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 blah. It's backward nonsense relative to where most of the rest of the world is going. But here we are, a former colonial power, fallen on somewhat hard times, looking for a friend, and so we cling to Donald Trump, and that's it.
I mean, it's not just the like looking for a friend. We're a bit locked in, especially post Brexit, to this relationship. Like, I mean, if we look at Trident, for example, that is a defense system that is pretty dependent on America. Like, we actually don't have nuclear weapons that we could just launch at anyone, like whenever we felt like it. So that, like, it's partly a dependence. Like, I don't know, we could extend the like toxic relationship metaphor, and it would take a clearer vision and a stronger leader in Keir Starmer to like begin to disentangle that. Although obviously we've just this week we've heard that the Chinese super embassy is going to probably be built in the UK, although there are going to be people that are objecting. So like, yeah, I think you're right. I think it's also that we're a bit locked into it and it's like the path of least resistance to continue. I think it's a really good, I mean, the China stuff is really important. And I think it also, given we're talking a lot about international relations, is sort of the hallmark of the way it is exercising power in the world, which is really economically. I mean, who can say? I wouldn't want to make any predictions at the start of 2026, but so far, China's power and reach has come from economic relationships, which are not problematic. As someone with African heritage, like that lock in relationships with countries rather than invading countries, rather than its army turning up on the border between two nations. It's like, we're going to be trading with you, we're going to be building in your country, we're going to create economic ties that kind of solidify our position. I mean, does that sound right to you?
I think that's brilliant. I mean, that is how the Chinese Communist Party conceives of what it's doing, and it's how you conceive things like the Belt and Road Initiative over the last it's probably 15 odd years now, isn't it? Maybe postdates that, but
Yeah, I'm trying to think when that was
it's about
announced.
2030, shortly after Xi Jinping became took to his various sort of posts that he holds in 2013 or so. I think it was launched, and that has been a colossal investment, starting in sort of Central Asia, spreading now to places in South America, which of course Trump has his beady little eye on, and has been, and Africa, huge investments there. Now you are right to say this isn't all sunshine and roses for everyone. There are significant issues around the forms of exploitation and what return countries are getting out of some of these relationships, and what kind of debt relationships in particular that are being formed around some Chinese loans over the last sort of 10 years or so. I mean, there are significant serious questions to be asked about that, but it's not the sort of the pattern of, hey, we're going to turn up and kidnap your president. That's not the kind
and his wife.
and his wife.
Yeah.
It's clearly not the same kind of relationship, and clearly, to the extent that it is Chinese technology that is driving what we have. I mean, it's deeply imperfect, but what we have for a kind of clean energy transition, that's actually not a bad thing to be happening, right? If you've got places in Africa that now have much cheaper, more reliable electricity that is low carbon,
skipping the fossil
I can't
fuel
really
stage,
say that that's a bad thing.
It's definitely a net positive. And I guess final question on that, and then we'll move on, is, so this news is great. Carbon Brief are great. If you aren't familiar with their work, they're like wonky and amazing, and definitely worth signing up to get their newsletters and things. But does this mean that, because you're an economist and lots of your work is focused on climate change and the transition that we need to make, is this news part of a bigger trend that we can feel vaguely optimistic about, that because of this, the tectonic plates of India and China are shifting towards a low carbon post fossil fuel world? Does that mean ultimately, for all the posturing, for all the net zero denial, that this is the shift that's going to happen? Whether it happens fast or not, I don't know, but should we be optimistic?
Well, the shift is happening, and it's happening in the rest of the world outside those kind of older bits of accumulation that we sit in, that's in the US. I mean, look, it's still happening in the US. The economics of renewable energy production are pretty clear now. I mean, Donald Trump has a particular sort of animus against wind for some reason, but it's still really cheap to build now, to build a solar panel and to install a battery and to get on with it. I mean, you get people doing it on their homes. I mean, this will carry on regardless of what Donald Trump is doing, unless he sort of outright bans all forms of renewable energies across the entirety of the US. I mean, I'm not sure he'd have the authority to do that, but this is happening kind of everywhere. It is not happening as fast as it needs to. It never has, but it is there. And it means the world in the future is going to look different to some of the worst case scenario predictions of 10 or certainly 20 years ago. That's not where we're ending up. So you can be relatively optimistic about some of this stuff. It's still problematic in the sense that it's not fast. It's still problematic in the sense of who owns these forms of generation, who gets the money that's going to be made out of it. It's problematic in the sense of this, going back to Greenland, there's a big old demand for all sorts of critical minerals, from copper to lithium for batteries, to all sorts of more obscure things if you're really trying to seriously electrify the world. And there's some big old questions, if you take the global picture, about rising demand for electricity is also producing an increase in the use of fossil fuels in some parts of the world. You can see this most clearly in the US. There was a big increase in gas turbine energy generation, driven along by things like data centers. They're going absolutely mad building these sort of behemoths, energy using behemoths.
AI.
And also, we shouldn't forget, it's just such a long way to go. I mean, Carbon Brief's figures is that China and India, between them, were responsible for 93% of the increase in carbon emissions in the decade before 2024, right? So it's like, this is good, but you've gone a long way in the wrong direction, let's face it, already. So, maybe the thing can turn, and maybe we can be a bit optimistic about that. But there's a lot of hard work to do.
I'll take that. Maybe it's enough. Okay, so my under the radar for the week, actually, I feel like it sits neatly with the last story and most of the others. Under the radar for this week is Davos. So probably the word is familiar to listeners. If not, I'll give you a quick recap. Davos is a place in Switzerland, but it is famous for the World Economic Forum, which is this annual event of like the great and the good. Should we say the great and the good? Annual event of like business people and world leaders and economists. It's represented or sort of like parodied in succession. All of the chief executives, loads of the world leaders arrive in private jets to this skiing village. They descend at the end of January to like put the world to rights. I mean, some of Davos's greatest hits. I was trying to think. So the idea of the G20 is credited with having been created at Davos. De Klerk and Mandela, the first time they sort of shook hands in 1992, that was at a Davos event, or at least the first time outside of South Africa. So it's like this been for decades now. I think it's just like 1971, this annual meetup that has grown in significance about the world economy. And so the reason I think Davos is going a bit under the radar at the moment is two things. So number one, Trump is coming to Davos this year, which was not the case last year. I think he maybe gave a video address and maybe like sort of gave a speech. But basically, the people running Davos have very aggressively courted Donald Trump successfully. Biggest delegation of like Trumpian figures, since the last time he was president. And I think the second thing I want to say about Davos that like isn't being talked about that much is that Davos has fully divested from kind of wokeness. It's all about AI, nothing about diversity, sort of a mention of climate change, but like not in those terms. And I mean, I don't know. I'm sure you've got opinions on Davos. I don't know if you've ever been, but I think like the thing about the World Economic Forum that I think we don't talk about enough is we live in a world where there are lots of people who have conspiracy theories of various political flavors about political elites, economic elites, global pedophile rings. And I think sometimes we do miss that like all the rich and powerful people do get together at these things and hang out and talk. Like whether it's Jeff Bezos's wedding or the World Economic Forum, like they are all together, like literally. To do a callback to the very start of the show, David Beckham is in Davos right now. Unclear why. Presumably he's fielding a lot of questions about Brooklyn. But like, I think we can't sort of just gloss over the fact that all the rich and powerful people get together every year to like put the world to rights. And I think the second thing to say is that Davos is definitely, it's not a trendsetter, but it's very much riding the waves of what it thinks is like the mainstream of political and economic thinking now, which is like, forget all that diversity crap. Let's get Trump and the MAGA crew down and talk about AI. So yeah, I sort of feel like there's more to be said about this than has been said. And yeah, final thing, which I will say is that Xi Jinping is not there. So there are a lot of world leaders, a lot of European world leaders. And I wonder if maybe this is like the last gasp of the old order trying to be like, we're still relevant in this Swiss ski resort. I don't know. Have you been to Davos? Would you go to Davos?
I've never been to Davos and wasn't planning to attend anytime soon. But do you know who is going? I think for the first time this year, man of the people, Nigel Farage, of course. You know, so much for the insurgent populist.
The Coots bank account. He's going to Davos.
There we go.
My
no,
God.
so truly a gathering of the world's elite and the great and the good. You know, there's something with this whole woke thing is just how quickly it was all ditched. You know, like that sort of mild pretense that you might, as a major corporation, really care about, you know, oppression in various different forms and Black Lives Matter and all that. And it's like, within about 6 months, I think it's all completely evaporated from like whichever form you want. And you're right about Davos as well. It was Larry Fink, wasn't it, from BlackRock? Apparently, has been leading the charge to make Davos great again. You know, to get Trump signed up and to invite various of his retinue over there. They've been given a special hut. Apparently, I'm imagining something. There's a special America First hut.
They've got a house, like a sort of I think it's like I can imagine it's sort of like party conference or COP or something. Like it's like there's a lot of the geography of it. I've got a Davos anecdote actually. But to finish your point about, so okay, so they're making Davos great again. There's been a PR campaign.
I was just, and it's worked, and they're there, and it's not going to be like hugger hoodie. God, that's a blasphemous. Basically, sort of woke liberal capitalism. It's going to be, you know, just capitalism, full stop. And how we're going to run the world. I think Keir Starmer isn't attending at the minute, but I'm guessing he will do because Donald Trump has apparently.
Maybe he'll jump on a plane.
Exactly.
I think Rachel Reeves is definitely there if he's not, and maybe he'll jump on a plane because of all this Chagos Island
Chagos
stuff.
Islands and Greenland and Donald Trump.
Feels a bit desperate though, doesn't it?
Really
Following him.
does.
I mean,
he really ought not to bother. You could do a video address or something like that. Not that anybody, I suspect, would really turn up to watch the thing. But the final bit is actually, you're right. It's like you don't need to, and you shouldn't get conspiratorial about this. I mean, most of the time how capitalism operates, it's really obvious. There's like very wealthy people and corporations, in fact, spend a lot of money to sort of keep the world operating more or less the ways that benefit them. I mean, that's kind of, there we are. And every so often they will meet up and have a chat. It doesn't mean that they're not all, fundamentally in competition with each other, which is one of the really big things you notice about capitalism. Like companies and states and individuals compete, but they'll meet up and have a chat and talk somewhat in a roundabout manner about how the world might be better, at least as they would understand it. A few years ago at the World Economic Forum in Davos, this was the old climate change and Black Lives Matter and various other sort of tick box exercises of woke capitalism. This year, as you say, it's AI.
They had Greta Thunberg. They had Greta come in the past to come and give an address at Davos.
Don't think that's going to be happening again anytime soon. But maybe what we got now is a more honest Davos,
Yeah, less of the veneer of respectability. Yeah, I guess it brings home that this stuff was a veneer and it was just a sheen of something that felt trendy or relevant. And as soon as it's no longer convenient, it is cast off very quickly. The only Davos story that I want to tell is my very first job where I worked in corporate PR. We had a chief executive going to Davos and I was like the junior researcher, lackey. And the thing that is hilarious and fascinating about Davos that connects to what you just said is, so I had to prepare a briefing for this chief executive of like everyone he might meet, sort of Devil Wears Prada style, like pictures of people. This person is this, Mark Zuckerberg runs Facebook. But the other thing that I had to spend quite a lot of time that I'll never get back doing was trying to get him into the Google party. So just like cast your mind back. This is the noughties. Google are still cool. And every year at Davos, there was a Google party. It's like Elton John's Oscar party. It's like it had a light up dance floor. And this chief executive worked for a financial institution. I won't say which one. And I just remember like ringing around and kind of desperately trying to get him an invite to the Google party because that's where all the cool like corporate people were. And I just wanted to share that just to say, all of these global wealthy elites, they're people too. They're insecure. They just want to be at the cool party. They want to be at the cool table.
I wondered where you're going with that one. Okay, yeah, no, they have feelings too. Yes.
They have feelings too, fragile feelings. But yeah, I mean, I think it's just gross, isn't it, that they all get together? But I think you're right that it is possible for people to get together and there not be a conspiracy. The way that the world works, it does much more feel like cock up than conspiracy. But I think the other thing that I think is a bit more nuanced is part of the reason that we get groupthink and these huge blind spots from elites is that they all hang around together with people. And like, even just to get to Davos, you need to be on a private plane. I'm pretty sure like you can't just kind of rock up on the train or the bus. So it's like part of the groupthink comes from the fact that they move in these like similar worlds in similar ways. It's not just that they're all sitting around being like, ha ha ha, like let's scheme up some terrible things. Is that they all live in this weird kind of privileged, wealthy bubble where like they have to justify their own wealth and power and one another's, and that in itself is sort of part of the problem. Putting aside, the Rupert Murdochs and the Larry Ellisons and the people who genuinely do have a vision for the world that's scary and horrible. They're just hanging around together too much. Part of the problem.
I mean, socialization's real, right? And you get socialized into a particular way of thinking about the world and you hang out with these people all the time and it's a complete bubble. You mentioned Succession, actually. It does a good job of showing like the mad little bubble that people are inhabiting at this point, and that's how these people live and that's how they exist.
I think we'll leave it there. Thank you, James, for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure as always.
Where can people find you and your work?
If you go to Macrodose podcast, which is out every week with a very short, mercifully short account of the top economic stories and environmental stories happening in the world, you can listen to that. Or you can find me on what I'm still calling Twitter at Meadwaj, Meadwaj.
Yeah, it is incredibly short and snappy. Macrodose, definitely worth a listen. Thanks a lot, James.
Thank you.